Let's see which one.
I don't see him. Let me ask him. Sorry.
Ini lah ada sih.
I signed in a little way too, so okay. This mute. He's gonna need to share his screen too.
Okay. This iPod screen.
He's gonna need to share his screen.
Hello?
Hi, Richardo. You can start.
Hey. So hi, everybody. Just making sure I'm good. So hi, everybody, I am Richardo Barrett. I am the Associate Curator and Museum Technician here at the gallery. And today we will be going over art care. Some of the topics we'll be addressing is how to care for art, the types of art, and some of the different materials that you may or may not want to use when you produce your own work. Especially a lot of artists, young artists as yourself who start off, you know, some of the do's and don'ts, and getting into the technical ability of it as well. So as we go through this, I am going to be doodling. It's a pretty good exercise for you guys as well. So if you want to doodle along, that's great. And I would support this as an active kind of tool in art practice as well. Kind of hones your technical ability and keeps your mind engaged and, you know, hand-eye coordination with your future art endeavors. So let's go. So if everybody is ready, we could start. So intro to art care. And just so everybody knows like what I'm using. So I'm currently on an iPad Pro, and I'm using the iPad Pencil. And this is an app called, Paper. It's a very interesting app for a while. And as you can see, like you have different journals, and it's really good for sketching. But you can never beat old school just book and pencil. So if that's what you have, I highly suggest using that as well. Started off doing that and ended up using this. So intro into art care. So when we think about art, um, a lot of up and coming artists such as yourselves and professional artists alike tend to focus really heavily on creating the artwork and not much about care before or care afterwards. Um, and this is not surprising because as creative people, we tend to just want to create, and that's fine. But learning how to care for your art, whichever piece that may be, whether it's a painting that you have, or if it's essentially, a piece of sculpture that's presented on an easel. And you see like those exterior sculptures outside, at the fountain or wherever it is. Um, a lot of times we think about the piece, but we don't think about, how it stays there, what what makes the water in that fountain like go up and down, maintenance, those kinds of things. We don't really think about those. We just know it works, and we go from there. But there are a lot of questions that are involved in how an artwork lives into the future. And sometimes if we actually sit down and think about those things, they highly influence what type of materials we use, whether it be a painting, and you're using like acrylic paint, or you're using oils. A lot of times if we use that information, it could heavily influence the way we produce the artwork, and also um, how we work the materials to suit whatever kind of application we wanted to have. So a lot of you guys tend to use pencil right now. So a lot of you are very familiar with the pencil. So in this app, I could mimic the pencil tool, and you could see all these different like applications in terms of how you use the pencil. And as we go through this, you guys could ask me like what I'm doing as well with the different materials, because we have an eraser, a smudge tool, ink pen. We also have a marker. We have a liquid ink pen. This one is more calligraphy. This is a pencil marker tool, your standard ink pen, a paintbrush, and then we have the more precise tool that's more so for making sharp edges, cutter tool, paint roller, and so on. And some of these actually apply to like real life drawing materials. So if you have any questions, you could just ask. And we could go from there. So like I was saying, we started off, most of you guys are familiar with the pencil. And the reason getting into art care, starting with materials, the reason a lot of artists use pencil is because of what it's made out of, graphite. And graphite has been engineered to stand like the test of time. So you have a lot of materials that are traditionally used because it's been proven to, again, stand the test of time. So a lot of you often wonder, I know you did a drawing class, or some of you did a drawing class yesterday with Jody Minnis, and you saw she used charcoal and those kind of materials. A lot of those materials are based with the same kind of technology or science behind it. And it's mainly because, again, a lot of those materials stand the test of time. A lot of them are made to work in a specific way for a lot of artists, and they create some very interesting results. So as we go forward, sticking with the pencil, I'm just gonna make some different kind of gradients, you know, the different smudge techniques and cross hatch, which is what this is right here. And then you have this technique called stippling that happens, where you basically make small dots, and these small dots come together to add like shadow, or, you know, give certain highlights to a piece or texture as well. And with the pencil, you could make a pencil drawing on paper, and that pencil drawing will last for a very long time. But there are materials that you guys use every day, whether it be in class or outside of class, and you know, you want to hone your skills, and that could be things like your ink pen, which most of you would have for a certain class. And this ink pen, like when you doodle, for instance, in the back of your textbook, that textbook wasn't made essentially to last like forever. So it could probably last for a couple years without it fading. So that would be like your regular ink pen you buy and, you know, make notes with in your textbooks. And the reason why that is discouraged is because the type of technology that was engineered to make the ink that's in those specific pens weren't made for, you know, an extended to last an extended period of time, and not with any like high quality engineering involved. So you often find that they fade significantly over time, and they don't provide any real benefits to an artist who wants their work to last into the future. So ink pens that you use in school is a no-no. So we don't use them. We don't encourage the use of those ones. We don't encourage the use of those handwriting pens for serious like art projects. If you're just doodling in class, fine. But if you want this piece to essentially be something that you could look back at years, way amount of time into the future, I wouldn't suggest using them. Stick with your pencil, your standard pencil, standard paints, which I will go into right now. So as it relates to paint, so we address pens, which are ink pens you normally could just buy in the store and use for notes in class. Those are no for drawing artwork or any piece that you want to last into the future. This also applies to the paper you use before we get into the paints. This also applies to the papers you use. And again, paper that you normally find in a textbook with lines in it. Usually lined paper as a whole is a no-no for creating artwork. If you're just sketching, if you're just trying to, come up with some ideas for a project, that's fine. There's no issue with using that. But if you're creating an art piece that you hopefully want to sell or give somebody, or you just want it to survive, we don't use those lined papers in the textbook. You either go out and you buy like actual artist paper. So a lot of those papers are materials you could find that are stone pressed. Some of them are referred to, or when you buy a sketchbook, those types of papers are more along the lines of the type of paper you want to make your artwork on. They usually come in, your standard sketchbooks that you could buy at your various like art stores and so. And you want to make sure that they all have acid free. That's a very important, and acid free, just to break it down in simpler terms, the paper itself does not yellow. So no yellowing. If you look back at some of the pieces you might have done, or even old paper or notes or letters, you could see that there's a lot of yellowing that happens with those sheets of paper. And anytime you see that happening with a piece or a piece of paper, that's a no-no. That means it's not acid-free. Or you see what appears to be like little, almost like blemishes, almost like wrinkles, not wrinkles, freckles, sorry, like freckles, like in the paper after time. That means it's not acid-free. If you didn't know before you bought it, and you see this happening over some time. And the thing about paper that's not acid-free is not something that happens immediately. It's something that happens over the course of a year or a couple of years, depending on the way you store the piece as well. But eventually it will happen. It will have this yellowing effect and it will tarnish the piece you created. Acid-free paper also, so it does not yellow, and it also doesn't interact with, or it isn't, what's the word I'm looking for? It doesn't react. It's non-reactive. So it doesn't react to when you apply certain mediums to it. So again, that's either your pencil or is either your pencil or clicks. So different paints as well, whether it be watercolor paints and so on, doesn't react to those. So you could easily put those onto and be ensured that it won't have a reaction and it will survive and not give you any problems into the future. So pencils are good to use, acid-free paper. We spoke about the different reasons for that. And when it comes to going back to ink pens, when you think about ink pens, you remember those? Pretty sure you guys had discussions about that in high school, where you have those very inky pilot pens that everybody used to want to use all the time. Those are along the lines of better pens to use, because what they tend to do, and again, as I do this, if you want to sketch as well, you can. Sketching is a great way to retain information. It keeps your mind engaged, especially creatives, up and coming artists as ourselves. Pretty sure everybody could attest to doodling while there's a meeting or something happening. So you can do along as well. So when it comes to those pens, like I gave the example of the Pilot, those inky pens, what's happening when you apply that pen to a piece of paper, so you can imagine this ink coming from the pen. So what happens is the Pilot pen, that ink penetrates the actual layer of the surface of the paper you're using. So you can think of this top layer, and I'll have different colors to represent the other layer. So this blue layer you could think of as like that first layer, and then we could think of that deeper layer as like the a next layer before you reach the bottom of the paper. So sometimes when you use the pen, especially those very inky Pilot pens, and use it on certain sheets of paper, what tends to happen is it bleeds all the way through, because those papers, they weren't made, especially if you're in a textbook or those black and white school books you use, it wasn't made to withstand that inky pen. These pens are usually made for thicker pieces of paper, and the thicker the sheet of paper, the less likely the ink will penetrate all the way through. And you don't necessarily want that to happen anyway, because what will happen that the ink will spread, and that initial drawing you did, this is a basic example of like a drawing. That initial drawing you did, whatever it is, eventually what's going to happen is the ink itself is going to spread. So wherever those lines are, like over time, the ink is going to spread, or it will spread while you're doing it, because the ink flows so much that eventually it just spreads all over the piece. And what you're going to have happen is, over time, the piece is just going to get messed up. So when you're using materials, it's very important to know what you're using and how different materials interact with one another. So for you, your best choice in terms of if you want you're that type of up and coming artist who wants to use a pen, I would say go with the Pilot pen, the Pilot ink pens, because they're a good basis for future pens. But if you use these pens, you're going to have to use thick paper, okay? So those are those sketchbook sheets, a lot of paper that is intended for art use or painting, drawing. They tend to be able to handle those Pilot ink pens. And as you do more research or get into your practice, there are various types of pens you could use that produce that same ink quality that a lot of Pilot pens that give you that deep, rich tone that could last. And we want to avoid those big pens. One second. We want to avoid those, those big pens. I think Bic is like one of those famous brands that a lot of people use. Those really inky, they're like this sticky, inky pen. Like I said before earlier, that we use to take notes in school, just to write every day. Avoid the pens because they tend to also not last. They don't do well, and as they dry, as the pen loses its viscosity or like that fluidness, almost like oil, they dry out and they fade away. So whatever piece you made eventually just disappears as well. So it's a balancing act with the materials, a lot of materials you guys use. So I'm just realizing that some of you might have some questions. If you guys have any questions, you could use the raise your hand feature.
Awesome stuff so far, Chardo. Thank you so much. So we're just going to take a quick break for questions if anyone has any questions so far. So what you guys can do is you can use the raise your hand feature so we can see that you would like to interject with a question or a comment, and then we can allow you to talk with your microphone. Or if you feel more comfortable just typing out your question, you can use the chat feature as well. And we'll have Chardo address those questions. So you can either use the raise your hand, which should be in chat at the bottom of your screen. or you can just type your question in the chat box. All right, back to you, Richardo.
Okay, so like Roman was saying, if you guys have any questions, you could just ask, and as I go through, I could answer them. So as I was saying, and continuing from the standard pens that everybody uses, you don't want to use them, and those are like the big brands, and various versions of those types of pens aren't the ones you should be using, because they don't stand the test of time, and they have a lot of properties in them that don't support longevity as a whole. So again, so we want to stick with the pencil, so your standard HB graphite pencils or charcoal, as I know some of you are aware of, and the pilot pens, and then you have the acid-free paper as well. So those are like some of the basic materials that you should like focus on in your early art practice in terms of like what you should make your work with, so that it survives. Going into paints as well, we should keep in mind that there are like various types of paints and quality of paints that tend to have different properties as well, different ways of using them, different ways they apply to a surface, penetrate or not penetrate a surface. And you have to keep that in mind when you use them. It's good to experiment, but I find that experimenting is more so for later on in your practice, or when I say later on in your practice, like pieces that you feel more confident with, like when you're more confident with a material, you could actually manipulate it the way you want. And then you're pretty sure that that piece or that work you're producing is gonna last, which is the overarching theme we're trying to reach here when it comes to caring for your piece.
Richardo, we just have two questions from
Okay.
our attendees. One from Tamia Knowles.
Okay.
She asks, how did you start off as an artist?
Mm-hmm.
I
Okay,
don't know if
that's
you want to address that now or maybe at the end. And then we
no, I
also
mean, yeah,
question.
okay.
Go ahead.
I could answer that right now. So I started off as an artist, very briefly, just to answer it short because it might be long. But when I was in primary school, which is interesting, there was this kid who used to draw a lot, and I think he didn't really care about like school as much. He just wanted to draw, and I used to do a little bit of doodling, like how I do now, and I wasn't really that interested in art, but it became sort of like this competitive thing for me to be as good as him with sketching, because he did a lot of sketches with cartoons and anime in general. At the time, it was like Dragon Ball Z and Pokemon and that kind of stuff. So I was trying to like beat him, in also proving that one, you could still be interested in schoolwork and get good grades, and also, just be good at creating or just be an artist in general. Because at the time, and even now, a lot of persons who are into art or artists in general, especially in schools, are associated with persons who are not like, as intelligent or, that sort of thing. So it started off as a competition or like a goal for me to kind of compete against this guy to prove a point. So that's like my earliest memory of getting into art. I hope that makes sense. That answers your question.
Really interesting. Yeah, we also have another question from user intermediate artists. They want to know if they can use pilot pens for outlining their artwork and the paper's thin.
I would say again, like when you use certain materials, I would test it out first. So get the similar type of paper or a piece of that similar type of paper that is that drawing that you've already done, that you want to outline with a pilot pen. Test it out, like take that pen and make a smaller drawing or a test drawing and outline it first and just let it sit, just watch it and see what happens. Because it's all about experimenting with materials as well. And like I said, like if it's just a sketch or a drawing that you're experimenting with, then it's fine, because whatever happens, happens. But if it's a piece that you want to, again, survive and not change into the future, then I wouldn't recommend it. I would test it, like I said, take a similar or the exact type of paper and do a test of it first. And if you like the results, and then watch it over time, like maybe give it a week, give it like a couple weeks if you willing to wait that long and see what happens. And if there's no change, then I would say go ahead. But it should be fine with the pilot pen. But like I said, you should just test it out because it's all about learning, figuring out the materials and everything else. I hope that answers your question.
Richardo, that's all the questions for now. If you want to continue on with your earlier point, and I can
Okay.
you can field some questions later as well.
Okay. So talking about paints. So you already addressed pencils, which are pretty standard. Pens, preferably inky pens like the pilot pens, are better, especially using the correct type of paper. And charcoal, those sorts of materials, like those art materials that stand the test of time. Again, using the proper paper applications for them as well. And now we're getting into paints. So you could see on my screen, this app mimics watercolor paints like really well. So this is just an example of the way watercolor paints like interact with your standard sheet of paper. So with watercolor, you have to essentially test the results or experiment more, because there's different types of watercolor paints, and paints that give you that watercolor effect. So for some people, they add more water to your standard acrylic paints, or they just buy the actual watercolor palettes that you could buy. Pretty sure you guys see them in before. They are just the flat palette with the watercolor blocks in different sections, and you just wet your brush, you dip them inside, and you apply to the sheet of paper. And what that does is that kind of gives you a certain like effect with the application. You have a lot of old school artists, I would say, that use that watercolor paint on paper because it has bleeding properties that other people might want to avoid, which you might find like aesthetically pleasing that works with what you're trying to achieve, and they use it. But with watercolor, you tend to have more chance of problems happening in the future. So, for instance, with watercolor, if you have an accident where there's a bucket of water and it spills on that piece, that actual art piece you have going on, it will mess it up. So the problem with watercolor is that it's not stable. It doesn't, when after it dries, it's not stable. So once water gets on it, it just damages that whole piece. So that's why you tend to have a lot of people that don't use watercolor for that reason. But a lot of people love it because the effect it gives, the type of properties, the essentially the way it moves along the paper, and it gives this sense of fluidity and just the aesthetic. A lot of people love it, so they continue to use it. And at a certain point in time, in the past, this was the paint that was readily available to a lot of people. So a lot of people didn't have a choice in using watercolors, because it was either watercolors or oils, and a lot of people didn't want to really bother with oils because of the fumes and everything else. So because of that, and it's standing the test of time, because one of the properties with watercolor paint is once that paper is secured and it's stored properly, nothing will happen to it. Once it's acid free as well, the paper is acid free, nothing will happen to it. It will stay there and it will stand the test of time. Which is also another reason why it's used time and time again for a lot of individuals when they're creating their work. But with watercolor, again, you just have to be careful when you're using it, because it is one of those things that, again, can be messed up with just a little bit of water, a little bit of moisture getting to it. It just completely ruins the piece. Even with fixatives, when you spray on top, so there are different types of fixatives that they call it, and there are different compounds that you spray on pencil drawings or even paints. So watercolor applications, it has applications for watercolor paintings as well. But even with those, you still have to be extra careful with watercolor painting. Another kind of painting material that a lot of people use is acrylics. I'm going to try and see if I could mimic more along the lines of what acrylic paints kind of feel like. But acrylic paints are more of that thick body, or more of a deep pigmented tone paints that a lot of people use like straight out of the tube. Pretty sure a lot of persons are more aware of what those paints are. They're usually, they come in a tube. And like I said, they have a lot more body to them. So that those paints would use like, spray out, put it on a palette. And you mix them together. So those are we talking about those acrylic paints. The acrylic paints, especially when you're just starting off, you don't need to get like those really expensive acrylic paints. Okay. You could start off, there's a brand called, I think it's actually called Basics. Can't remember right now, but I think it's called Basics. But it's just standard like acrylic paints. You could actually start off with those and, you know, proceed from there, because acrylics and oil paints as a whole could be very expensive. And as you get into them, you'll see why. Some of them are have deeper pigments, thicker body, as in the actual paint itself is thicker. So when you're like buying and going out for these paints, just keep that in mind. And certain acrylic paints don't, like brands, don't work well with other brands. So I would stick with, if you're using one brand, stick with that one brand and go from there. But then again, just keep it in mind that you could also experiment and see what works best for your actual application, okay? And when it comes to acrylics, these work best for the beginner artist because it dries really fast and it actually gives you a little bit more freedom to correct mistakes in terms of reapplying again and continuing. And you don't often get that with a lot of like watercolor paints. Like once watercolor is down, it's down. It soaks into the paper and there's no way you're taking it out unless you start over completely with a new sheet of paper. So those are the things you got to keep in mind, especially with acrylics. I mean, with watercolor as opposed to acrylic paint. And acrylic paint, again, is fast drying. So you don't have to think about, you know, when is this painting going to dry? Is it going to have any issues? And you tend to, what you see is what you get. So as it dries, there's no issues. You don't have any like issues with the actual paint, because acrylic is quite forgiving with those applications as well. You tend to not have any mistakes that happen that you can correct. And what you see is usually what you get with acrylics. But some of the plus sides are actually, or some of the positives or pros are also cons to acrylic paint. Because it's fast drying, you tend to have a lot of problems with, again, things that you might want to work on for a little bit longer. Things that you might want to work on for a little bit longer, and the paint dries on you like really fast, so you can't. And that's where we get into oil paints. So as you get into oil paints tend to have more of a forgiving nature as it relates to drying time, because the drying time for oil paints is a lot longer. So you tend to have the ability to go in to a painting a day or so later and actually correct mistakes or make adjustments, which is totally different from acrylics. So I would say we're actually going into the type of medium you want to use or experiment with. Those are the type of things you keep in mind that you know how the material works and what it works best for you. As it relates to what those paints are applied to, we either use canvas for acrylic paints, or actually use paper. And paper is, again, one of those materials you want to make sure that it's actually acid free. Again, that it's a thick sheet of paper that works well with the paint, because some paper actually buckles with the paint as well. And we want to make sure that however you're applying the actual acrylic paint is not too dense or filled with water. So those are the type of things you learn as well. But acrylic paint works well on paper, like very thick paper, or canvas. And when you're getting canvas, that's another thing. You could either get raw canvas, and that's that essentially you could buy. You could buy it in a store, or you could actually get raw canvas. There are fabric stores here that sell just the unprimed canvas. You have Home Fabrics. You also have a place that's in Palmdale called Knowles Upholstery that actually sells canvas as well. So if you have the time, to get canvas, and it's fairly reasonable. If you are an artist who wants to start off practicing, on canvas, and you could prime it yourself, you could get white paint, prime it, and paint on it. Or you could just buy the standard canvases that various art stores here sell, and those work well. Those work as well. And getting back to acrylics, so acrylics could be used on paper or canvas, like I said. But when you're working with oil paints, you want to stick to canvas. Canvas and canvas-like materials that could withstand the different chemicals and compounds you have to use when you're mixing oil. That's another thing with oil. I would say if you're actually going to use oil, tends to be a lot more research. There's a lot more compounds that are in paint that need more attention. So that's something you have to be aware of. I don't recommend oil paint beginners, persons who are just like getting into painting. I usually recommend acrylic paints or even watercolor paints, because oil paints tend to have you more in a financial bind, because you have to buy things like linseed oil. You have to be able to mix the consistency of the paint fairly good, and you have to be quite accurate with those mixtures as well. Also, in applying it to the canvas, there's ways in which like things could go wrong, and your paint could crack earlier on than later on. So you might even like put yourself in a bind by going into oils too quickly without a lot of research. So keep that in mind as well. But it's primarily used on canvas. Oil is not good for using on a lot of paper. Even if you go with a heavier set of paper, you're gonna have like issues in the future, especially if water hits the paper or something happens. But it's usually recommended for canvas or linen type materials that are thick in nature. Oils work best with. And in terms of materials and everything else, I think that's pretty much it in terms of that. As we go into, you could see on the screen, there's this sketch I did or this little doodle with this face. Nothing too crazy. But just in thinking about paintings in general or handling your work, I would say for the beginner that does a lot of work on paper, your best bet is keeping that paper away from moisture. Keeping that paper away from moisture and in a dry environment, and making sure that wherever you store it, if you could find like a sealed application, whether it be like a Ziploc like bag or even somewhere where you know there's no humidity, that would be good. And when you're working with items like canvas, I would say take the same approach, but just be more mindful of where you rest your canvas. Make sure that the front of it, so this would be the front of your piece right here, where the actual painting or image is on. Make sure this piece is either protected with something or it's actually facing a surface where it can be poked with anything, or it can be like damaged in any way, like any rips in your painting, that sort of thing. And I think once you apply those or have those measures in place, you should be fine.
So Richardo, these are all awesome things. We have about 1 minute left in this class. I don't know if we want
Okay.
time to just take any remaining questions that we have. We have one from Brina Bain, going back to when you were talking about Sharpies and pens, and she wants to know if it's okay to use Sharpies for outlining things.
Yeah, so Sharpies kind of fall into that same like inky pen kind of category. The only thing I would say with the Sharpie is because it has compounds in it, especially made for permanent like application, they tend to have properties that cause it to change in the future as well. I don't know if you noticed, but like sometimes if you use like a Sharpie, I know that that brand is very specific. Sometimes if you use a Sharpie or whatever, I could tell you my experience with using Sharpies in the past for different projects. Over time, what you have happened is if the material, the Sharpie you're using, um, reacts to the paper in a certain way, to a certain another element. Say you have like pencil drawing and you outline that pencil drawing with the Sharpie. What you have happening is it interacts with the actual lead or the graphite, I should say, the graphite in the on the surface of the painting, and you tend to have a discoloration that happens. So right where that Sharpie meets the pencil, there's like some discoloration that happens. And it doesn't happen all the time, but it's enough to, you know, just make you do a little bit more experimentation, like I was saying before with the pilot pen, to make sure that that's not, you know, something that will happen or affect. But like I said before, I would experiment. And if it's a drawing that you're comfortable experimenting with, I would say go ahead and do it and then see what happens. All about, you know, this whole thing about drawing and doodling and just staying creative is all about experimenting and seeing what happens. But I would say just be cautious because, like I said, it can react with whatever you're doing. If the entire piece is in Sharpie, then you should be fine. But when you start to mix different mediums, then I would be more cautious as to how I apply the two different mediums. Okay, so hearing that there aren't any more questions, so as it relates to just like closing notes, as it relates to Canvas works. A lot of you, when you use your canvases, like I was saying before, you're going to tend to have pieces that are either made with acrylic paint or experimental pieces, but all of them you want to store in that same way. Stay away from water. Stay away from like high heat applications. Make sure that wherever you're actually storing the piece, that the face of the painting, which is whichever side that the paint is applied to or whatever medium you're using is applied to, is either protected or facing an area that doesn't have any sharp objects, nothing like protruding into it, that sort of thing. Because canvas, even though it being very thick with all the paint and layers, is very easy to put a hole inside your canvas. And that could ruin an entire piece, because then you'll have to patch it and all sorts of repairs you'll have to make to that piece, which nobody wants. So those are like some of the basics about making sure that work that you've made, whether it be paper or canvas, are pretty good. And with that, I would say this is the end intro into care. And if there are any other questions, you could reach out to us. But I think that's it.
Awesome. So if there aren't any further questions, I think we're going to end there for today. Richardo, is there anything else you wanted to say before we sign off?
Sorry, I didn't catch the last part.
Yeah, I was just saying we're going to wrap this up here for today. Just wondering if you wanted to say anything else before we sign off.
No, I mean, I would just say that any of you guys that are getting into it, or you have pieces, a couple of you had questions about pieces as it relates to like ink pens and pencils. I would say just keep experimenting. And like I said before, if you could get thicker paper, those art intended materials intended for art projects, that would be best, because you could get better results and you could learn more about the different art materials you would need to use and so on and so forth. So I would lean more on the materials that could give you the best results, I would say.
All right, then. So I think we will leave it there for today. Thank you so much, Richardo, for all of the amazing knowledge that you shared with us. And thanks to all of our attendees, all of our participants who signed in. Yeah, you guys are also more than welcome to sign in and join our other classes that we have today. Well, one more class at 2 p.m. Yeah. Also, feel free to share whatever you guys may have been creating in your classes on our social media. You can also reach out to us by email to ask any further questions as well, okay? All right, guys. Have a great day. See you all later.